Well, Renee, thank you so much again for the opportunity to interview you. I just wanted to start out and kind of get an idea of how this series originated. Why did you want to tell this story and why now?
Well, it originated, it was kind of a confluence of events. I had uh, some years ago, after having been blessed with a long career in this business, I decided that I wanted to do that. My next project would be something God affirming, something I could uh, share with my church and my kids, which not everything I've done could be shown at church, let's just say. Um, and um, I sort of put that out there, just if it please you, Lord, use me. And it took a while, but then a writer producer that I really admire, Carol Mendelsohn, reached out to me years later and said she wanted to do a project about the women of the Bible, that she'd heard I was um, you know a believer, and so we partnered up to do it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. So let's talk a little bit more about this focus on the women of the Bible. So Genesis, more often than not, does end up kind of following the male narrative rather than the women. But because of that, that means that you were able to use this series to kind of fill in the blanks, add some events in, add in motivations for these women. So how did you and the team go about fleshing out their characters in a way that felt true to their biblical portrayal, even when it might not necessarily be explicit in the Bible?
Well, that's a great question, and it was a very liberating perspective. In some simple ways. For example, we didn't feel like the need to tell every beat of the Abraham story in Genesis. There were parts of it that uh, didn't involve Sarah so much. I mean, Abraham, gathers an army at one point and rescues his nephew Lot, and all those sorts of things. So it liberated us from some of the expected beats that we didn't need to do. Um, but our sort of true north was always trying to find the emotional truth of what these brave, courageous, bold women, but also flawed and like all of us, broken, and they stumble and they make mistakes, and you know um and it was a matter of really digging in, and it's possible to read Genesis, um and especially Abraham and Sarah's story, and kind of come away going, oh, Sarah's kind of the bad guy here. you know and but as I pondered that, and I also noticed, yes, she, you know, recruits or coerces or something Hagar to have a child for her, and then she banishes her later. And those are two, like, wow, that's hard to get your head around on one level. But I noticed something as I pondered it, that yes, it's true, but yet at the same time, the Lord validated her choices on a certain level. I mean, when Hagar runs away, God tells her to go back. He doesn't say, "Go, girl, you get to Egypt. You be free with your son." He says, "Go back." So God had something in mind for that child. Uh, I think He wanted him to be raised by his father. If even for just the first 13, 14, 15 years of his life. Um, and again, when Sarah convinces Abraham to banish Hagar, he doesn't like it. He doesn't want to do it. Um, but God tells him to listen to the voice of his wife. So, when I realized that, I was like, oh, then I'm missing something. I need to dig in, and that's when I sort of realized, wait, wow, she loved that boy. She loved Ishmael. It must have cost her. And she didn't do it because she was like, oh, now I have my own child, my own biological child. I think she did it because she intuited that this wasn't going to work. um, and that Ishmael needed to go find his own destiny, and that's the sort of that's kind of where we ended up. I don't know if you had a chance to watch it yet.
Yes.
Oh, okay,
Yes,
okay.
I did. But no, I loved that, and I thought that that was a really good perspective on things because you're right, we do see Sarah. I think at one point she refers to God as her husband's God. She almost like kind of
Oh,
offloads it on
really?
Abraham at first, and
Yeah.
so I thought that it was really interesting how you played into the doubt. You know, she laughs at God's plans whenever she hears that she's going to have a son. So I really liked how that played in, and I want to go back to what you said about showing more of like that these are flawed and vulnerable people because I think a lot of people define faithfulness and being faithful as this like unwavering perfection. But the show really shows that difference, that shows doubts and flaws with our main characters like Sarah. So how would you define faithfulness in the context of this show called The Faithful?
Wow, well, that's a good question. I mean, all three of these stories that we tell, the first one is about Sarah and Hagar and Abraham. The second one is about Rebekah and Isaac, and the third is about Leah and Rachel and Jacob. Um, and they all, you know, they all mess up. They all they're just finding their way. Carol and I used to say, last thing she said to me before I went off to write the first script, we sort of worked out the story. And before I went to write the first script, she said, Renee, write them like they don't know they're Bible characters. Like they don't know they're in the Bible. And it was really good advice. And I shared that with the other writers that we ended up hiring and even with the actors. Um, and I think, part of what I learned along the way, yes, they stumbled. Yes, they made a mess of things at times, but God always made good. God blessed Ishmael. You know, um, God. And Ishmael came into being because Sarah had lost. Sarah decided to take matters in her own hands. She had she kind of lost faith in the promise. Rebecca gets this put on her. She feels that God has called her to make sure it's Jacob and not Esau, the younger over the older. Very, not how it was done at the time. And it put her on a collision course with her husband who wanted some other outcome. So it's another story about a marriage, very relatable, I hope. And of course, the third story, Leah and Rachel, sisters falling in love with this, that's a different kind of marriage, and that had its own complications. Yet, if it hadn't been for that, there wouldn't have been 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. So, God makes a good work, as Romans says, to all those who are called to him. And I think that's the big takeaway that I came to, understanding that and being reassured by that because, you know, uh, we often hear that verse or we share that verse at times of trials, with each other, and sometimes those are words that they can ring hollow when you yourself are the one in a trial, um, you know, uh, and these stories I think are really reassuring in that truth that that Paul speaks of in Romans.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I've only seen the first episode, but I did want to ask, do you have a favorite episode that viewers can either look forward to, or is the first episode your favorite, or do you not have a
Um,
favorite child?
there are pieces of each one that I really love. I mean, I think the third one is really a lot of fun in a kind of a scandalous kind of way, but in a heartfelt kind of way too. But the first one is probably the most jam-packed. There was
Mhm.
more story there, and sometimes it was a challenge to fit it in this 2 hour thing we had allotted. In some ways, I think the second episode. There are things about the second episode that I really love. It's a very romantic story, in for Rebecca and Isaac. I mean, she leaves her home and marries a boy sight unseen. And that really intrigued me. Like, why is that?
Mhm.
Why did she do that? And um, And then she becomes a fierce advocate, you know, for his God, you know, that she wasn't raised in. She, you know, she was Abraham and Sarah left Haran, where she was from. She would have been raised in whatever pagan traditions Abraham walked away from, you know, when he answered God's call. And yet she came alongside Isaac very powerfully, and even ultimately in conflict. But she came alongside with him, at least in terms of this idea, the importance of sustaining this covenant. So the way that all played out is one of my favorite parts, you know, and we it took some. Yeah, I think it was there probably where we most sort of had to read between the lines and find something that it felt true. I'll give you a little hint. You know, you'll have noticed that in the first episode we don't actually depict the binding of Isaac, the near sacrifice of Isaac, and that's because we decided to do it in the second episode and play it more as something that Rebekah, you know, marries a man who went through something very traumatic, and she helps him um, figure out what it means. You know what it meant to have been. You know, because there's one. You know, yes, we know what it meant to Abraham, but imagine being that object of that, if you want to call it God's test. Um, so that was interesting. I really liked the way that turned out.
I love that. And that is interesting because I'd noticed the Binding of Isaac was missing from the first episode and I was like, well, you can't fit everything in. So it's
Yeah,
interesting to see,
yeah.
yeah, you saved that for the future. But you also brought up something that I had wanted to mention too, which you're right, that first episode is jam-packed because we're seeing Sarah from meeting Abraham at a young age all the way through to her death. So you talked a little bit about it was liberating not having to include every single event, especially from Abraham. But what were the challenges in telling a complete cohesive story when you're having to tell the story of someone's entire life?
You know, that is a challenge, and that I don't think I've ever done that before. You know, these stories do take place over decades. Um, and you know that had repercussions in casting, um, in all the episodes. You know, I mean, we have a young Jacob and a young Esau, and we have, you know, um, Jacob's boys, you know, seeing them grow up, so it was a real casting challenge to track. You need to you go, oh yeah, he looks like he could have be that actor, and you kind of got to, well, who's your sort of hero actor playing the character mostly, and then you got to sort of backfill. Um, that was an interesting challenge, and but I'm sorry, you were asking about what we had to.
Just what were the challenges of having to tell like a life story in the
Oh
confines
yeah.
of that hour and a half of television?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think when we hit on the idea that telling the one you saw about Sarah, part of it is you hear Hagar's voice throughout. That we didn't originally write it like that, and we added that spine
Hmm.
uh, in the editing room. We sort of discovered that in the editing room, and actually, it used to start with young Abraham and young Sarah, and but then we used footage from the time. We realized, well, the story really uh, is really about when Hagar and Sarah meet. So that moment where they first see each other on the banks of the Nile, um, we realized could sort of frame things, and I think that narration or voiceover or whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it helped us get over some of those, helped the audience understand when and where we were. You know, we used, we put up, what do we call them? We put up not subtitles, but, title things that would tell you where we were, how many years had passed, because we could tell that it potentially would be confusing, you know.
Yeah.
And we also used, like I said, the kids growing up. That
Right.
really, you go, oh, Isaac's 5 now, because that's an easy visual clue that time has passed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. That voiceover really does tie it all together. So that's interesting that you all kind of found that in the edit together. Kind of looking back at more of a career retrospective, you've been a part of a lot of incredible projects. You part with filmmakers like James Cameron, Steven Spielberg, Guillermo del Toro. What's the best lesson or filmmaking advice you've heard from one of them or from anyone else you've worked with in your career?
Um, Probably, and this is one thing that's really stayed with me was hearing Steven Spielberg talk about casting and casting actors and what he would respond to. And I share this with my friends who are actors or aspiring actors. What he would respond to is a sense that they were listening to the other actor, that
Hmm.
they hadn't come in and decided what they were going to do, and I know exactly how I'm going to play it. Um, but that they just trusted that, like, okay, I know the words. I've thought about it, but now in this moment, I need to listen and react and be in the moment and really listen to what the other actor is doing. Um, and Yeah, he would see people, he'd see people and go, no, she wasn't listening. No, he wasn't listening. And we would move on. And he obviously has great instincts about these things. And so that's one. Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's incredible to hear. It's like a small thing, but I can see that making a difference. So I want to be mindful of your time. I've got one last question for you, kind of a two-parter. What do you hope that Christian audiences will take away from this series? And if non-Christian audiences happen upon the show, what do you hope they might take away from the show as well?
Well, you just the way you frame that question is makes it easier to answer because I was going to say, we were always, Carol and I were always aware that we had potentially two audiences here, that there was a faith audience who would experience these stories. There's not going to be any suspense, right? Maybe other than like, how are we going to handle these challenging passages in scripture? Maybe there's some suspense there. And then also there was an audience that might be tuning in because they like period dramas or because they like Minnie Driver or whatever it might be. And we always were careful to try to speak to them both. And my hope, and I've heard this a little bit talking to folks who've seen it, that they've after they watched it, oh, me and my husband, we got out our Bibles and we were talking about, scripture and like, oh, that's not how I remember it, or I see why they made that choice, and they were engaging with what I hope was maybe a little slightly different perspective. But, more than that, it's my hope that folks who maybe are hearing these stories for the first time, or maybe these stories are dim memories from uh, Sunday school long ago, that they'll go to their shelf and pull off a dusty Bible that maybe their grandma left them and crack it open, and God can do his thing in their hearts, and you know that is my hope.
Yeah, well, it's incredible what you've accomplished. I love your witness and your being able to be a part of telling these stories. So I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, it was fun talking about it. I appreciate you
Yeah.
having me.